Now we have seen what's happening with all of these people who are on his candidates list losing their accounts because they're part of a formal organization headed by a sanctioned individual. Now I see them trying to switch again to say it's a PPP who's telling these banks to sanction them, and they're using the U.S. ambassador.
You could take those statements by Guyana's Vice President Bharrat Jagdeo as a recap of the story we're following on the closure of Azruddin Mohamed's WIN candidates' accounts by several banks in Guyana. Mohamed is the presidential candidate of the We Invest in Nationhood Party, WIN, and is also a U.S. sanctioned individual. Thanks for tuning in to The Final Takeaway, fastly becoming your favorite place to get the scoop on issues beyond the headlines. This story has pretty much descended into a it's not us, it's them type of saga. Let's get to the details, and please watch the entire video to get the full essence of the story. WIN Party alleges that the Guyana government has coordinated the closure of the accounts to spite WIN, their political opponent. Both Jagdeo and President Irfan Ali rejected the allegation, calling it false and blaming the decision on the U.S. sanctions against Mohamed.
They're blaming the government. We have nothing to do with that.
Perhaps more importantly, they allege that the decision by the banks to end financial business with a slew of Mohamed's party candidates is a direct consequence of the sanctions placed on Mohamed. On June 11, 2024, the U.S. Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, announced it had placed Azruddin Mohamed and his father, Nizar Mohamed, on the list of sanctioned individuals. The sanctions came after an extensive investigation into Mohamed and his father, both who ironically were once bosom buddies of the said government. In a published document, OFAC clearly warned financial institutions and other persons in the United States not to do business with the sanctioned individuals, or they could face consequences. Here's exactly what the document says. Quote, financial institutions and other persons that engage in certain transactions or activities with the sanctioned entities and individuals may expose themselves to sanctions or be subject to an enforcement action. Nowhere in this document did OFAC say that local financial institutions in Guyana must not conduct transactions with Azruddin Mohamed or his father or anyone associated with him. So the key question that arises is this: can banks in Guyana be penalized or sanctioned or fined for doing business with individuals associated with Mohamed, especially his party candidates, who are the people that were targeted by the banks? In its literal sense, the answer is no, and that's what we told you a few videos ago, that the sanction prohibitions on financial institutions were not expressly directed to banks in Guyana or elsewhere in the world, only to U.S. banks. Despite this, Jagdeo and Ali have been telling the nation otherwise for weeks. The U.S. ambassador to Guyana, Nicole Theriot, recently weighed in on the matter. When asked by the media whether the sanctions have implications for banks in Guyana doing business with these party candidates, the ambassador made it clear that the sanction warnings apply solely to U.S. financial institutions.
There is absolutely no association. The OFAC sanctions are for the U.S. They're the U.S. government, and they pertain solely to what happens in the United States and business being done in the United States. The decision by the banks here was entirely independent.
The ambassador automatically placed the Guyana government on the defensive. At his weekly press conference days ago, Jagdeo humbly concurred. He admitted that the ambassador is correct. Let's bring in Jagdeo again.
All the U.S. ambassador said is the banks didn't call us, the embassy, and that the OFAC sanctions are in the U.S. Well, that's true, but read what the sanction document says.
But he didn't stop there. The government's claims, he says, are linked to sanctions implications regarding correspondent banking relationships with the United States.
If you go online, you will see how many banks in the United States of America, when they don't do due diligence and allow sanctioned individuals or those associated with them to have a relationship with U.S. banks, those U.S. banks have been fined, they've been warned, and they could eventually lose their license. The United States institutions. So yes, the ambassador is absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Generally speaking, a correspondent and respondent banking relationship is where two types of banks work together to facilitate international financial transactions. Typically, both banks in a correspondent relationship maintain accounts with each other to track debits and credits. So in that sense, the banks are connected, but they don't control or get involved in each other's corporate or administrative affairs. They remain independent financial institutions for all intent and purposes. But here's the catch or long-reaching implications according to the Vice President.
So if they, through the local banks, start doing business with the sanctioned individuals or those associated with them, they have implications for them in the United States of America, those banks. So when Gabi issued a statement, the Guyana Association of Bankers, they said we operate in two frameworks, the local and international framework, not just local framework. They, without a correspondent banking relationship with the United States banks, they might as well shut operation down. You can't process your credit card payments. You can't process your debit card payments. You can't make a transfer of money. You can't bank your reserves in the U.S. You can't invest in U.S. instruments if you have excess reserves in these commercial banks. You think any bank locally will risk that? In their own assessment, they have to protect themselves.
We were not consulted. We were not asked. We have no opinion on the matter. The banks here make their own decisions.
Let's bring it all together and put things into context. Clearly, banks in Guyana are not among or expressly named in the OFAC warnings as financial institutions that can face sanctions or enforcement actions for associating with sanctioned individuals directly or indirectly, and in this case, we are speaking about Azruddin Mohamed. However, according to Jagdeo, the local banks have closed WIN candidates' accounts to avoid the perception that they are affiliated with Mohamed through his associates. So far, they include Demerara Bank, the Guyana Bank for Trade and Industry, GBTI, the New Building Society, NBS, and Citizens Bank, and we understand more banks may follow suit. If the local banks continue their financial transactions with WIN candidates, OFAC may interpret this as U.S. correspondent banks indirectly dealing with a sanctioned individual in Guyana and may therefore sanction or fine those U.S. banks. To avoid this, the U.S. banks may cut ties with these banks in Guyana. Therefore, to avoid the risk of losing their correspondent banking relationship with U.S. banks, Guyana banks are severing ties with Mohamed's associates instead. So it's like a preemptive decision. Now, we haven't verified whether the U.S. banks, through an internal memo, warned the banks in Guyana, but one should not rule that out, even though the ambassador said Guyana banks make their own decisions regarding the sanctions. As always, we invite you to tell us what you think in the comments section. Do you think this is an overreaction by the local banks, or are they under political pressure? Stay tuned for the next video coming right up.